Many of us think if we've got enough financially for what happens next or retirement, we're going to live a relatively worry-free life. After all, if you know you've got enough financially, surely every other worry you can have about what happens next or retirement pales in comparison. But here's the thing. There's a retirement challenge we never seem to talk about. One for many of my clients and many people I speak to is the most important challenge we need to consider when thinking about what happens next in our lives. And that's encapsulated in one word: identity. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the fundamental challenge nobody seems to be talking about, a shift in identity as we retire. And there's 7 things you can do to make sure that as you transition into whatever happens next in your life, your identity isn't a challenge anymore. Welcome to What Happens Next. Now, there's certain days in somebody's working life that they typically tend to remember. And there's one particular day that I think I'll remember for the rest of my life. It was when a client came in to see me, and he had worked with us for a number of years. And every time I saw him, year in, year out, he was telling me how much he wasn't enjoying work. Now, we built his financial plan, and everything on the financial plan said he'd never run out of money again. Financially, it was going to be great. It was going to be okay. Everything was going to be fine. And I was curious, year in, year out, about why somebody who was really not enjoying what they did for work carried on working despite the fact that they didn't need the money anymore. Now, this guy, Steve, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Chris, I know I'm not enjoying work. I know I've got enough to make sure I'm okay. But here's the thing. What am I if I'm not that?" And for Steve, work was such an important part of his identity. Just carrying on meant that he didn't have to face the fact that in retirement, our identity tends to shift. But that's natural, and it's something that I want to talk about today. And I think it's really important we're honest with ourselves. Retirement, semi-retirement, or whatever happens next in your life isn't the endless holiday it's made out to be. You may be financially secure, but emotionally and psychologically, there's still significant challenges, with one of the main ones being our identity and how it shifts when we're in this chapter of our lives. Now, the good news is you are not alone. A 2020 study from the Stanford Center on Longevity found many retirees feel lost, particularly in the first 18 months of leaving work, not because of the money, but because they lose their identity. We spend decades building a professional identity, a work identity. So it makes sense that actually when you leave work or change what you do, it does leave a gaping void. And I think the first thing we need to do is talk about it and accept that it's completely normal. I know that us Brits, if you're watching this in the UK, us Brits have normally got to keep calm and carry on and don't talk about this sort of stuff. But I think it's an important subject to discuss so that we can look at the practical steps we can take to redefine our identity, particularly in our 50s and 60s, and we're considering what happens next. Firstly, I want to talk about why identity loss hits us so hard. And I think a recent article I read in The Guardian said it best, because a professor who's writing a question to The Guardian's agony uncle said, "So much of my personal identity is tied up with my profession. How do I define myself without it?" For a lot of us, work isn't just what we do. It's a huge part of who we are. Over the years, your work gave you structure, purpose, and a sense of being needed. You had workmates to laugh with, problems to solve, goals to chase. In retirement, all those reinforcing signals can vanish overnight. Now, psychologists have got a really interesting term for this. It's called identity foreclosure, when someone's sense of self is overly defined by one role for too long. And that might sound familiar to you. It happens to all of us, Olympic athletes, military personnel, surgeons, and yes, people who are senior in business and business owners too. Because our society doesn't train us for the emotional upheaval of this identity shift. We get tons of advice about pensions and ISAs and money in general when it comes to retirement. But I believe, and this is part of the reason we're doing What Happens Next, that we need to explore some of the additional challenges we face in this chapter of our lives. Because many people, and I've seen it with my clients, are caught off guard by the feeling of disorientation in this chapter of their lives, particularly when they've been successful and competent at what they do. And listen, we're all human. There's nothing wrong with feeling that disorientation. It's completely natural. In fact, the National Institute of Aging reported that rates of depression in the early years of retirement can increase because of that fundamental shift in identity we go through. Often the ingredients of good mental health are baked into our careers. We're surrounded by people, we've got good social relationships, we're intellectually challenged, we've got a community, we get a sense of purpose, and that sometimes can disappear in the next chapter of your life. So the challenge is real, and the challenge to reform that identity is hard. The good news is hard doesn't mean bad. With the right approach, we can also take ownership of this shift in purpose and actually make positive change in our life. And today I want to share 7 tips that you might want to consider when you're thinking about that, navigate the next chapter of your life, and how to do it successfully from an identity perspective. My first tip is, if you're doing work you love, appreciate that you can carry on. Conventional retirement, where we stopped work at a particular age, is a relatively modern concept. For thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution, we just simply carried on working until we couldn't anymore. So if you actually love and enjoy your work, bear in mind you don't need to stop. Now, my experience is that often people do reach an age and a time in their lives where they want a better balance between work and life, and that's important to consider too. But knowing you've got a choice about whether you can stop is the first natural step. I've got clients who carry on working not because of the money, but because of the intellectual stimulation, sense of purpose, social connections and community. And actually continuing to work and knowing you've got the choice to is tip number 1. Tip number 2 is appreciate retirement as a flight path, not a cliff edge. Often people think about retirement, and I get why this is scary, as finishing work on a Friday and having nothing to do on a Monday. And there's so many options available now, including the flight path concept, which is gradually slowing down the amount you work. So instead of going from 5 days to no days work, actually look at going from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 at your pace, or carrying on working if you want to do that, but doing it in a way where you can get acclimatized to the next chapter of your life gradually, not instantaneously. My next tip is going to sound really simple, but it's important to remember, I believe. One statement that I always say to clients is, you are not your job. When we get to our 50s and 60s, it's often an opportunity to untangle who we are from what we do for a living. And I know it's natural to turn up at parties, and often the first question out of somebody's mouth is, what do you do for a living? But you are not your job. Now, the process of re-exploring who you are without your job starts with a set of questions. What do I value? What are my personal values? What do I enjoy doing? What do I love? Where are my skills? How could I positively use those skills without the world of paid work to contribute to society? All of those are really good start to 10 questions to consider when you're thinking about what happens next. Because the skills and knowledge you've acquired throughout your career don't stop when you stop work. Maybe you were an amazing mentor at work and you can use those skills to coach young business owners or spend time with your grandkids. Maybe you've got a strategic mind and you can build plans to help people. And you could use that skill at your local non-profit or charity. One useful concept I like to think about is a concept called identity bridging, which means carrying pieces of your pre-retirement identity into post-retirement life. So think about the aspects of work that you love that felt most you. Was it problem solving? Was it making social connections? Was it the intellectual challenge? Finding ways to take what you loved about work and apply it to your new world is fundamentally important. I had a client a couple of years ago who used to speak to me about the excitement he got from training young engineers to do a really good job. There was other parts of his role that he was doing before he retired that he really didn't enjoy. And actually that made him feel that he needed to stop work. But this element of training and mentoring young people gave him real satisfaction. So when he retired from his full-time job and became financially independent, he spent some time training young engineers and got real satisfaction from that role. Now, there's one important thing we need to talk about, and that's ego. Now, the Stoics used to talk about the fact that ego is the enemy. And it's really important to remind ourselves that our job title is not our worth. My favourite philosopher emperor, Marcus Aurelius, talked about ego being the enemy, and despite all his power and expertise, knew that putting himself in check and realising he was not his job title was really, really important. But he also talked about the fact, and he wrote a lot of this in Meditations, that amazing book, I'd recommend you read it if you haven't, is not fearing ceasing to live, fearing never beginning to live properly. Because actually, if you're carrying on what you're doing because you're scared of what's next, then that then robs you of the opportunity of an exciting life in the next chapter. I mean, after all, the real failure is to cling on to your identity so tightly and not giving you the new you a chance to live. You've got nothing to prove anymore, and that's really liberating. So I think it's time to rewrite what we say about ourselves. Instead of, I'm a chartered financial planner, I am a curious learner, an advocate, somebody who likes to explore new opportunities. And it's a mindset shift. You're not starting from scratch. You've got bucket loads of experience. You're just applying it in a different way. One way to make the identity whiplash of changing from work to retirement a lot easier is to plan for the emotional, financial and psychological aspects of this change really well. Often when we're at work, we plan everything. Yet too many of us retire without a plan. And my clarion call for today's video is make sure that you plan not only for the money, but also for the emotional and psychological transition you're going to make. I've recently come back from Portugal playing paddle tennis with a bunch of amazing guys. There was a bloke called Bob who was on our trip. And he'd produced a second life assessment prior to his retirement. He's retired now, where he looked at all of these aspects of his life and asked himself some really deep questions about what happens next for him. Now, Bob produced his own 12-page document with a bunch of questions highlighting what questions he should consider when thinking about the retirement chapter of his life. But I know that often can be difficult. And that's why in 2026, we're publishing the What Happens Next book. Now, below you can find a link to join the waiting list for the book. But what we're also going to be doing early in 2026 is building a community and a course that's going to help you navigate this chapter of your life. If you'd like to find out more about that and join the waiting list for both the book and for what we're going to be launching, which is going to be incredible. I'm working really hard to make sure it's really good, in early 2026. If you're watching this and you've got your phone in your hand, click the QR, take a photo of the QR code below. It will take you to the What Happens Next waiting list. And we'd love to help you on that journey. But you might choose to, like Bob, to build your own What Happens Next plan. Bob's document had a financial assessment, a relationship assessment, a physical and mental health assessment, and a digital life assessment. But feel free to use the What Happens Next model, available on our website for absolutely free, because actually thinking about the balance of your well-being in all of those areas might be worth thinking about. My fifth tip is to give yourself permission to experiment. Retirement, or what happens next, isn't a one size fits all. In fact, we know that there's no one right way. Some people work part-time, some start second careers, some volunteer, others focus on spending time with their family. It's whatever works for you. But my recommendation is try some stuff out to see what fits. You might think about the first year or two as prototype years. And I know that on this channel, we always talk about an amazing book, Design Your Life by Bill Burnett, who talks about design thinking when we're thinking about our own lives and how low cost experimentation, doing stuff to see whether it works for us, is a way to go. Now, you don't need to do everything at once. I'd recommend you pace yourself and stay flexible. You don't need to get retirement figured out on day one. Trying new stuff, however, is going to be a fundamental part of working out what your identity looks like in this next chapter of your life. The Stoics give us a really important reminder on this one, because they said one step at a time is all anyone can take in the present moment. So taking that natural next step when you're thinking about the next chapter is the right thing to do. My sixth tip is to build a new routine. Now, if you find yourself in retirement and it's 11 o'clock in the morning and you're in your dressing gown watching the Homes Under the Hammer, you might want to consider whether retirement is working for you or not. Now, there is something amazing about the freedom this chapter of our life potentially gives us. But humans are creatures of habit. And whilst it's amazing to have freedom and flexibility and important, too much freedom and flexibility can become deadly. So consider what you want as part of your scaffolding in terms of habits. I'd suggest that you focus on the three elements that are really important: sleep, exercise, and self-care. And my recommendation is to read the amazing Atomic Habits by James Clear, because he talks about shifts in identity, implementing positive habits in our life, and how we can do it. And actually, when we're navigating this change, thinking about habits is a really important thing to do. My last tip is to ensure you both build community and social connection in the next chapter of your life. One of the toughest aspects often with leaving a job or a career you've been in for a long time is that your social universe can shrink. The office can often feel like a second family, dysfunctions and all. And even if you were glad to leave behind meetings or office politics, you might miss the camaraderie that comes often with working. Because we are social creatures. We're not meant to live life in isolation. But actually making an effort about building those social relationships is really important. I think one of the things you can do to make sure that you maintain a robust sense of identity is actively make the effort to build community. Now, I know that this often, for many of us, can feel a bit awkward, but in my experience, both in my own life and in my clients, making the effort to build a social connection has such a positive impact. You might want to start with your existing social circles, friends you don't see often enough, and you want to, now you've got a bit more time on your hands, build that social connection again. Beyond that, seeking out groups of like-minded people might be the solution. Thankfully, there are thousands and thousands of groups that you can join, particularly in the UK, if you're looking for like-minded people. You can join a local walking class, a local rambling class. You can join a book club at a library. You can join a wine tasting class. You can, like my wife, take up pottery, or like me, take up paddle. There's so many different opportunities to build social and community connection. One community I adore is the Men's Sheds Association. Now, I'm not a member because I'm probably the least practical man in the world, but communal workshops where blokes who, let's be frank, aren't always best at building those social connections. My experience is that women tend to be better at that, where blokes can make and mend things together. This organisation has been massively successful, and 90% of people who joined the Men's Sheds organisation, 90% said they felt less lonely. The bottom line is, don't go it alone. Life is a team game, and isolation can creep up on us if we don't take positive action to counter it. So they're my tips to consider when you're thinking about re-navigating your identity, when you're thinking about what happens next. But I'd love to know yours. What's the one thing that you'd recommend as a tip when re-navigating your identity, when you're leaving a career and thinking about what happens next? Please feel free to put that in the comments below. And if you're interested in hearing more about how philosophy can teach us about what happens next, you can find a really popular video on what the Taoists, the Eastern philosophies, can teach us about retirement there. And in the video I mentioned earlier about falling off the retirement cliff and what we can do to make positive change in our lives gradually using the flight path method, you can watch this video here. Have a lovely day, and we'll see you on the channel soon.